We are very, very thrilled to have this keynote because from a very early stage when Maggie and I started thinking about this symposium at some point in like the fall, we wanted to do something on narratives because we knew that that was a conversation that we need to have more of. And I think we could not think of anybody better to get us sort of grounded in this conversation of narratives than Moky.
We met Moky at the School World Forum, and it was very clear that she focuses on exactly that issue. In addition to lifting up the power of art and storytelling, Africa No Filter is an important model for how we can recognize bias, shift power, and norms globally. And Moky is going to begin the presentation, and then she's going to be joined on stage with Shaheen Kassim-Lakha from the Conrad Hilton Foundation in a conversation, and then they'll have you join. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon.
All right, and so with no further ado, we'd like to welcome Moky Makura, Executive Director of Africa No Filter, with some appropriate Afrobeat.
Thank you, thank you. You guys did the middle-aged let's clap instead of dance. That's all right, that's all right. So I just want to say Africa is having a global moment right now. The world is dancing to our music. And if you're not dancing to it, your kids are in the clubs across Europe. They're listening to it. We're winning Grammy Awards. The world is watching our films. Netflix has just invested over $170 million in creating African content. Yep. What's the next thing I was going to say? Art. There's global demand for African art. Apparently, the market for African fine art is worth about $1.8 billion. Our fashions, we're inspiring global icons. Beyonce is wearing African designers. Dior is collaborating with African fashion designers. And our food. There's a huge number of African restaurants springing up across America, across the world. And if you don't know about the Jollof Wars, you have not been following popular culture. The point is all of these cultural global moments are slowly shifting the way a whole new generation is experiencing Africa. And usually that generation is a younger generation. But it's not resonating everywhere. I was on a train from Berlin to Bonn, and a young, well, I don't know if he was young, a man from Norway got on the train. We were sharing the same carriage. And I started talking to him, and he said, you know, where are you from? I'm from Nigeria. And I asked him, you know, if he'd ever been to Africa. He said, no, he hadn't. And I asked why. He said, well, it's not the place that I want to go. After a little bit of cajoling, he actually confessed that his image of Africa was a place of poverty and conflict. And actually, it wasn't a place that he felt he wanted to go to. And I asked him, where did you get that impression? Because he's never been to Africa. He was almost dismissive when he said, well, it's from the stories. There's so many stories. It's the news stories, it's documentaries I watch. That's how I get the impression about Africa. It actually struck me then how powerful stories are in terms of influencing people, shaping their opinions and dictating their worldview. And it's not just the stories that matter. It's the stories that are told persistently over time that ladder up to a single narrative. And a narrative is a central idea or belief about, in this case, Africa. So I run an organization called Africa No Filter, and every day I wake up and I think about narrative. And when we first started, which was 3 years ago, I wanted to understand what the stories and what the narratives were around Africa at the time. And this was just 3 years ago during COVID. And what we found by sort of scouring through academic literature was that there's sort of 5 key frames through which many, not all, but many stories about the continent are told. Poverty, disease, conflict, corruption, poor leadership. it led us to understand that there were three prevailing narratives about the continent. One, that Africa is broken. Two, that we're dependent. And three, that we lack the agency to create the change that we need. And the challenge with that is that Africa is obviously so much more. But narratives have an impact on two really important areas: how the world sees us as Africans, but also increasingly how we see ourselves. So I want to just spend the next 5 minutes talking about how we got here, what's happening today, and then the future that I see. So I'm going to ask a question. Who here remembers 1985? And by remember, I don't mean you were just born then. I mean, genuinely remembers 1985, a few of you. In 1985, there was a equally massive moment for Africa. Can anybody tell me what they think that might have been? Live Aid. Live Aid happened. And I think today we are living with the legacy of the image that Live Aid created for Africa. I was in my late teens when I watched Live Aid, and I remember thinking there's a real disconnect between how I perceived my continent and how the world saw it. I mean, Live Aid was, it was in response to an atrocious thing that happened. There was a famine in Ethiopia, millions of people died, or over 1 million people died. And Live Aid raised huge amounts of money. It raised something like $140 million for famine relief. So it saved lives, and I'm not knocking Live Aid. But what I think it did was seal our fate as a continent that needed saving. And a whole industry has been born out of this desire to save Africa. And I think a lot of it is based on this unconscious perspective that people have about the continent, because so much is changing. So I'm not going to ask you what your perception is about Africa or what you believe, but you'll probably find that it might be guiding the kind of investments you're making and how you're structuring the investments you do make. So if 1985 was how we got here, 38 years later, today, where are we? Africa No Filter, we invested in 2 studies. One was with the University of Southern California, where we looked at how Africa shows up in US media. And very quickly, we found 2 things. One was that in 700,000 hours worth of entertainment, there were very few mentions of Africa. So entertainment and news, there were very few mentions of Africa. But where there was in news, it was usually around politics, and the stories were around crime. And where it was in entertainment, so these are like, series, comedies, usually the storylines with Africans involved were crime related. So that's how Americans are perceiving Africa. We also went further. We did another study on how Africa showed up in African media, because African proverb, if you point one finger, there are 3 of them pointing back at you. So we wanted to understand, how are we as Africans perceiving ourselves? What we found was that 81% of what Africans were reading about other Africans was negative. And that's because most of the news that appears in an African outlet about another African country comes from a handful of global news sources. So it's Reuters, AFP. So in the case of how Africans are perceiving each other, we're not the ones writing stories. And that leads me to understand there's a bigger problem. Africans, we don't know ourselves. Because believe me, when I lived in South Africa last year, what I would read about, say, Gambia or Mali was exactly the same as what an American sitting in Boston would read about Gambia or Mali. That's problematic. But where are we today? I mean, so that is where we are today. So what is the future? How do we change this? And It's not easy because I deal a lot with stories, but I realized that facts don't change people's perceptions. We know that. I mean, I don't know how many of you know or have read, Factfulness, Hans Rosling's book. In it, he says, numbers, the world cannot be understood without numbers, but the world cannot be understood with numbers alone. And I agree, we need stories. We need more stories. We've already seen how stories influence, they inform, they can educate. But more importantly, we need stories to help us craft an African dream, particularly for our young people. We need an African dream. So at Africa No Filter, we advocate for better representation for Africa, not just in news media, but in films, in any kind of content you're reading or seeing about Africa. And we ask for two things. One, that the world tells better stories, and that we tell stories better. By better stories, I mean just the stories of amazing young people doing amazing things. There's entrepreneurs creating businesses, there's social impact entrepreneurs doing amazing, solving some of our challenges. We just need more, many, many more stories of those being seen in the right places. But we also need stories to be told better. And by that, I mean the difficult stories, which we still need, because Africa does still have challenges like everywhere in the world. But we need to be careful about how we frame those stories. We need to understand, who are we making the hero of those stories? Is it the issue? Is it the poverty? Or are we humanizing the people in our story? And I like to use the example of the Ukraine war. And I've watched how the world has covered the Ukraine war. They've humanized this war. We almost know the people. We understand their battle. We identify with them. It could have been us. Just think about how you read about conflicts in Africa. You don't know the names of anybody. Where you do see people, they're usually in the victim position. They've been injured, or they're not the hero. The Ukrainians have become the hero of their own story. And I just use that as an example, not that I'm wishing for war so that we can have our stories told properly, but just to understand that there is a lens through which often our stories are told. So if we can get the world to tell stories better and tell better stories, we're getting a little bit closer. But the problem is that not enough funding goes to storytellers. Africa No Filter is one of the few African investors in the creative sector. We fund artists, we fund journalists, we fund visual artists. We've even funded an EP, an album, because we thought it was making people rethink Africa. And I'm going to leave, that's my time done. I'm going to leave with a quote, one of my favorite. It was not a quote, it's actually a proverb. And the proverb is, until lions learn to write, hunters will tell their stories for them. So I ask that you help us be the lions that write. Thank you.
And how we let an entire continent, Africa, burst into flames while we stood around with watering cans.
And there won't be snow in Africa this Christmas time.
Are there bookshops in Nigeria?
I think it reflects very poorly on French people that you have to ask me that question.
Currently, for every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries.
you even convince anybody from outside so that they don't have wrong perception about you. Convince your own people.
Thank you all, and thank you, Moky. An inspiring, thought-provoking presentation for us to all consider. And we'll get into some of the tactical conversations in a little bit, but I just wanted to start with, well, first of all, we've known each other since the beginning of this program and organization that is Africa No Filter. And I have been watching from the sidelines the amazing work that you've been doing. I'm sure you will have all seen that Moky is an extremely dynamic, energetic leader, and the organization has grown phenomenally. I've got a front row seat as one of the donors, and we'll talk about some of that too. But I just wanted to see if we could make a little bit more explicit the implicit bias that you talked about, particularly for philanthropy, because we are all, of course, subject to what we're reading in the general media. But can you speak to how that shows up in your experience?
Well, I think for us personally, because Africa No Filter is a donor collaborative, we've almost been given unrestricted funding to do what we do. So for us as an organization, I feel that there's a little more trust. There's a little bit more, these guys have agency to determine what works best. But, you know, we do see that, you know, this thing about locally led development and allowing people to kind of, who know the work, who, you know, it's not happening everywhere. I think we are very blessed and very lucky because there is this perception. There is this perception that, you know, we need to kind of figure out what the problem is. We need to figure out the solution. And we're just looking for local partners to help us implement the solution we've already determined. And that's based on this kind of narrative that, you know, Africans don't really have the agency. And I was in Sweden last week, 2 weeks ago, and one of the policymakers, they have a program in a country in Africa, and she came up to me and she goes, you know what, but the government people that we work with, they don't seem interested in coming up with a solution, you know, so that's why we have to come up with the problem and the solution and then implement it ourselves. And, you know, again, I sort of asked her, you know, if you come to my home and you tell me you need to build a roof and you ask for my help, and I'm like, I don't need a roof. I need to figure out how my children are going to go to school. I'm not going to help you build a roof. And you're going to walk away with that, think, oh, Moky doesn't have any agency in her life. I'm going to do it for her. Give me a beautiful roof. I'm going to rip it down and I'm going to sell it and I'm going to send my kids to school. That's what I'll do. And that's what happens.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. We are so often restricted ourselves in the type of grant making that we want to do, that then gets superimposed onto other organizations. But let's explore the work of Africa No Filter. For, you know, what have you done in the last 3 years?
Gosh,
it's a lot.
It's so funny when we have our funders meetings. I always get told you're doing too much, and I tell my team, let's not tell them all the things we're doing because we get accused of doing too much. And actually, I mean, part of that was a certain amount of urgency to get this work done. I mean, we never know when our funding's going to end or how, you know. And I'm just like, let's just do as much as we can. But I think there's a couple of key, really big things I think as sort of making impact. And one of the first things that we did was we started looking at how do we create these stories. And we set up, actually, on the back of the report we did on how African media shows up in Africa, or how Africa shows up in African media, we started a news agency called Bird. And actually, we put out 2 narrative shifting stories a day. We've got 140 media clients, all in Africa. I think we've signed something with an international media outlet that wants to take our content. But that was the way we felt we could make impact, because we didn't want to be a publisher. In fact, I got a lot of people saying, hey, I want to tell you about this. I'm like, we don't publish. Otherwise, if we'd have to create a platform, get traffic there. We're not a publisher. But we're running a news agency, and it's really effective. We've got a full-on newsroom. We've got contributors from about 40 countries. I don't know, to date, we put out, I don't know, about 800 stories. And increasingly, we're doing projects like sponsored projects. So we did a whole series on climate action in Africa, which went out during, what was that big thing that happened around climate recently?
Well, the Africa Climate Summit.
No, not that one, the one
Okay.
before, the one, COP27,
yeah.
yeah, that was it. So yeah, that's one of our, I think, a big strategic thing we've done. And there's been quite a few other things.
But let me pick up on that, because one of the things that you've often brought to our attention is the need to fend off these requests for making narrative work for a particular sector, right? I mean, the whole flexibility that you're talking about was based on you would determine where that change needed to be made. It wasn't about, some of us were very tempted to say, well, could you create some content for our health work and make it, have a social campaign around it. Talk about how you've had to resist that.
Yeah. Well, we not entirely resisted it. We've actually created a partnerships division, and we now do projects for other organizations that are aligned to what we do well, which is we're an intermediary. We can give out grants, quite small grants. We can manage that process. We have different ways of doing due diligence. But we can, and we understand narrative, and we have a network of journalists and writers and storytellers and creatives, and we often try and bring creatives into this space. So we've worked with quite interesting organizations, and you know what, programmatic money is very tricky money. I like the donor collaborative money because it lets us do what we do, and we just get on with it. But, I think no organization can, survive if you're just waiting for unrestricted funding. So we do work with various different organizations on specific things. So we've done stuff on climate. We're probably going to do something on migration, narratives around migration. We're doing another project on climate. So we're quite busy, but yeah.
No kidding, right? So I get to sit on calls every quarter with Moky, and she will list off all the work and stuff that you will have been doing. So you are extremely busy. But some of the things that have come up for me in that work is the work that you're doing to re-grant some of this. And, one of the grantees, or a creative who was a recipient of a small fund, was Moon Girl.
Right, of course, Hansen.
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say what she does. Moon Girls is a series of comics that she does where, African women are superheroes. So again, she's rewriting that narrative and putting African women in the sort of hero position. So she's great.
African women, and is claiming back a pre-colonial story and narrative about Africa in the process, right? So going back to the roots and rethinking some of the assumptions. I mean, you rightly talk about 1984, 85 as being a moment, but really the history of modern Africa was shaped in the 19th century by people who were equally interested in saving us from ourselves, right? And so I think there is a long history of it, which she's been able to do. That was really interesting, to go back and find those creative ideas that she was learning from her grandparents and others. And so it's not just about today's stories, it's bringing them back. So that was one of the ones of real interest. Funding the arts is not easy anywhere, including here, right? Seeing a real decline in that. But how do you, and in a way, if you're looking for the type of philanthropy that maybe a lot of us represent, it's hard to make a case for the arts when we're so much about, there are other issues, it's like the roof issue that we want to fund. How do you make the case in a development arena?
I mean, I think in a way, because we are about narrative change, and narrative for us evolves from stories told over time, right? So I think our definition of storytellers has become loose because we saw there's a gap in funding of specific art. So, visual artists, photographers, there's just very little spaces for them to turn to. And I think no society can grow, can develop without art. And, you see in, rich cities, like how much, just public free art there is. And, so recently, one of the other projects we did was, it's called the Creative Vibrancy Index. And we actually took 12 African cities, and we actually mapped the cultural and creative infrastructure there was, like how many theaters, how many sort of places of learning for the creative sector are there, like what's the infrastructure? But it was all around trying to see, is this city creative? And Johannesburg won the most one. I think that it was Cairo. I can't remember the top three, but it was just interesting to also see where the gaps were. Lagos actually was number 2, and actually that was driven because of the Nollywood industry, because they have a real film industry there. But it was clear to us that, and part of the reason why we did that, we did the index, because it was very research driven, was to show where the gaps are. So if you are a potential investor and you want to know where to invest, or if you're a funder, you want to know where to invest your funds, you can see where the gaps are, or you can see, perhaps where everybody else is. So it was a bit of transparency into what's quite a murky kind of space. There isn't a huge amount of research on to practical things in creative industries in Africa. So I think our index does that.
Great. And you've got several other indices as well, I think, that you've been working on.
Yeah, we've got a global media index
yes,
coming
yeah.
out. It's been like, it's a baby elephant. It's been birthing for so long. I don't actually know when we're going to see it, but we're looking at the top 19 through global media outlets. So New York Times, CNN, Al Jazeera, and we're ranking them on how they cover the continent. And, it's not necessarily just looking at it from what bad they're doing, or, but it's actually looking at what is good. What does good look like? So I'm quite excited by that, to see what comes out of that.
I think not all donor collaboratives provide flexible funding. So just to be clear about that, let's make a pitch. Let's make a pitch for that, okay. Right? And some of them are around the notion of collective impact with very specific metrics.
Right.
And but what does it feel like from your end to have to be reporting into 8 different donors, all of us with very different priorities and ideas? And
yeah, I mean, I think that's what's been unique about a donor collaborative, in that the funders almost have to give up their autonomy. They have to give up their sovereignty. So we don't do 8 different reports. They've all agreed to one format, one report, and one reporting timeline, which really frees us up to do the work. So we report on a quarterly basis, and they all accept that, and have adjusted their systems around that, which I think is fantastic. So I want to say thank you to Hilton for agreeing to be part of it. I think the other really interesting thing for us is, being part of a donor collaborative. I think there's an aspect of it that the funders also get to learn collectively. They learn together. And it's great having a managing board that's invested in it. It's not an advisory board. They're not just telling us, pretty things we need to know. They're actually invested because they're putting their money in it. And it's a way of de-risking the investment, because there's 8 of you. So the amount you put in and what the value you get out is a lot, because individually those grants, the grant that you give us, wouldn't be able to do the work that we are able to do. Yeah.
Exactly. And that, I actually really wanted to lift that for those of you who might be thinking that narrative changes feels too far from what we do, don't know how to get started. I think finding a collaborative and just taking baby steps and becoming part of that learning community is sometimes, it was in our case, a very good way for us to learn more and work with others who really, all of this is part of exploration and the beginning of a journey as we begin to address.
But can I just sort of respond to something you just said, that, for any funders who are thinking narrative change is a bit far, I always used to think, but why are these sort of American organizations funding an African initiative? Because that's essentially, what we are. And it kind of struck me that over the years, a lot of American organizations, institutions have been funding projects, trying to develop and support them and push Africa along and help us progress. But yet the stories that come out seem as if you're doing nothing, absolutely nothing. So I feel it's in everybody's potential interest to fund stories that show that there is progress, that the investment dollars that you put into Africa are actually making a difference. So, I feel that when people say, okay, well, we don't really fund narrative, and that's fine, you don't have to fund everything, and I'm very clear about that. But if you are looking at a way of showing value to the work and the areas that you invest in, getting stories that show that positive progress, I think is intrinsic to the program, or should be.
You've convinced some of us, so yeah. Just a couple more questions really quickly. One is, I've only got 1 minute, so I was going to speak, you're a Pan-African organization. And we're in the midst of these conversations about representation and diversity and inclusion in any which way. How have you, I know that you've raised some of the challenges you face in that area. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
What was the question? Sorry.
Yeah, how are you making sure you're inclusive as a Pan-African organization?
Pan-African,
yeah,
right.
yeah. So
I mean, yeah, the big challenge is that we are Pan-African. There are 54 countries on the continent, and we are trying to give grants in as many countries as possible. That means we've got to be deliberate about it, because when we do our call outs, first of all, we do a lot of call outs because we are trying to democratize the process, because people have said to us, oh, you need to know somebody to get money. And we're like, no, you need to just follow us on social media and we'll tell you, and you can apply. But what we find is the grant, responses come from, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, predominantly. We've had to do translations, so we're definitely doing French, we're doing Arabic. We're also asking people to apply verbally, so you can actually sort of upload a voice note as opposed to write, because again, we're assuming creatives, can put together tight proposals with outcomes and, measurables and deliverables. We know that's not the case. So we're really deliberate about trying to make sure that we're representative, because we cannot call ourselves a Pan-African or we're investing in Africa and do Kenya. And that's what a lot of funders do. We're in Africa. And I said, which countries? We're in Kenya. And often Kenya is not the country of the most need.
Dig at my country, first of all, yes.
It's usually the country that's best for holidays. They've got fantastic beaches there. And I'm not saying that's why people do it, but as I think Imar was saying yesterday, not that many people are investing in Somalia. It feels too difficult, but again, that's where the need is. And I think if you work backward and you just figure out where the need is, then that's where the money should go.
I'll end with this. It's 2030 for argument's sake. Moky, the lioness, has learned to write.
Yes.
She has a pen. What is the story?
The story would be that Africa is known as an innovation hotbed. And I don't just mean tech, just innovations across the board, but also I'm not looking for a single narrative. I'm looking for a multiplicity of narratives. So yes, we'll still have our challenges, but it'll still be an amazing place. I mean, I asked this young lady that I met the other day and in America, and I said, what do you think about when I say Africa? And she goes, gosh, what's that thing when people go, gosh, I'm forgetting my words. When people go on safari, she said safaris. She said, I think about safaris. I'm like, great. That's one thing you can think of. But I also want you to think about innovation and technology and creativity and art. And there's just so much that we have. We're a continent of 1 billion people. People say that, but it actually means something. 54 countries, hundreds of languages. And we cannot just be a single story. So if I could learn to write, I'd be writing all the time because there's so much to cover.
2,000 or 3,000 languages or something to cover it in. Yeah, so we're going to open it up. I just wanted to pick up and end with this, that the solutions that Africa and Africans are coming up with are not just for Africa. And I think keeping that in mind, and so President Ruto in Kenya just hosted the Africa Climate Summit, where the conversation wasn't limited to what are the solutions for Africa. It was, there's a global problem. And Africans are well positioned. We've done a lot of leapfrogging over the years. There is technology, there's AI that we didn't get into, that can be used for global solutions, and just keeping that in mind as reframing what Africa can do. So we have time for a few questions. And I'd ask that you use the mic, please. Who's got the mic? And somebody over there. Because we have people joining us on Zoom, so you need to speak into the mic. Oh, okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nasra Ismail. Moky, I'm a big fan, sis. I wish there was as many Africa No Filters for every mistelling of a story about Africa. Shaheen, big fan of you as well. Thank you so much for your work. I have this struggle, like you, about how do you convince people to fund work so that we don't end up in another several decades of mis and disinformation. I think that story about 1985 is probably the first mis and disinformation. And look how long it's taken us to appreciate how hard it is to pull back stories that are problematic. So I don't know if it's a funding problem, but I'm just asking you, how do you make sure you don't lose inspiration for the thing that you know in your heart? And we know as Africans, we are trying to unlive the stories that have been told about us. They're harmful. I would say they're like a public health disease, honestly. And I don't mean to say that like as a way to make an impact. I mean, stories kill, and they've killed investment opportunities for Africa and Africans for decades. So how do you stay inspired and pitch and grow this movement?
Wow. How do I stay inspired? I mean, you know, before I got this opportunity to run African Filter, I used to do this. I used to do this as a hobby. I was always telling stories. I wrote a book called Africa's Greatest Entrepreneurs. I did a series called, you know, Living It, about, you know, the other side of Africa that no one sees. I used to write articles. I've always done this. I think it was a reward to get this opportunity to actually do it with proper funding and to do it on the scale we're able to do it. So, you know, if I think about when I get up every day and I'm inspired, I'm honored to do this work. I think it's an absolute privilege. And I tell my team that every day almost. It's a privilege that we can do this work. And it's so needed. And I'll tell you quickly the reason why I think that when honestly, listening to Afrobeats, I got into the cab to come here. I opened the door, the cab driver was playing Afrobeats. And it's a subtle thing because it makes me feel happy that actually he's experiencing us in a different way. There's a generation of young people that don't have those associations about Africa. And that inspires me. Black Lives Matter inspired me because it opened the door for us to talk about representation, you know, and to bring Africa into the conversation. So there's a lot of things we're riding on the back of, and there'll be another one. So that inspires me. Thank you for that question.
Next question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Moss from the Agroecology Fund. Thank you so much. Amazing. And we, in the Agroecology Fund, we fund a couple of things that would be interesting to you, perhaps. The Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa has a campaign called My Food is African. So it's a media campaign also lifting back up traditional African foods with the rain and inundation of foods from colonial countries. My question is really, I'm listening to this conversation and I don't think I heard the term racism in either the description of how things became the way they are or the importance of using some sort of anti-racist frame in the narrative. I mean, obviously we know that the way things, all of what happened at Live Aid and much more in the long history has to do with white racism against African people of African descent. So I'm just curious about if you find the frame of anti-racism important in kind of the way that trying to restore the African story.
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, I think we choose not to frame it like that because I think that in itself triggers a lot of things. Because if I say, you know, you're racist, you'll tell me you're not racist. But if I say you have unconscious perspectives, you'll kind of think about it a little bit. And I don't think a lot of this is driven by racism. I think it's just driven by the way we've been framed, you know? And, you know, I tell you that story where I said I was watching Live Aid and I was sitting in London when that happened. I wanted to donate to Africa. I was like, oh my God, we need to do this. That's what I'm saying. It affects me as well, you know, and that's the thing. And I wouldn't call myself racist. You know, by definition, I don't know, you know, are Black people racist? I mean, I don't know, but it's not a framing that I think is necessarily helpful. And we're trying to move past it. So racism has its kind of, you know, people have a reaction to that framing. And it's not a reaction, I think, that's helpful to our cause, because we do want people to change. Yeah.
There's the mic over here.
There's big narrative differences between how young Americans perceive this country versus older Americans. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the different narratives generationally that you've seen some of your storytellers reveal.
I mean, I think I've said that I think young people experience, you know, Africa differently. I mean, I'll talk specifically about Nigeria. There's a movement in Nigeria right now called the Jackman movement, where a lot of young people are leaving Nigeria and coming to Africa, right? And I think that's driven by the sense that, you know, that there isn't an African dream. There's certainly not a Nigerian dream, and they need to go elsewhere to find it. So I think there's a generation of young people, because there are so many of them. And this narrative about creating jobs is not a narrative. You've got to create your own opportunity. We need to change the narrative from, somebody's going to give you a job to you've got to, create your own opportunity. And I think that informs, when you're young, you actually don't know what you can do, what you can't do, because I mean, that's why, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, they started these things at the age when they didn't know they couldn't do it. And I think that's what we have with young people in Africa who choose to stay. They're doing things, they're getting on with it. And I think, we need to reflect that as well. That, I didn't talk about it today, but 14% of the migrants that go, the global migrants are actually only 14% are African. So this perception that Africans are, flooding Europe, the majority of Africans remain in Africa. And, they are finding things to do. They're innovating in their own way, and it's not all tech-based, So there's a lot happening. And I feel that because these conversations that happen globally about development are amongst people who are not in the youth generation, we're not Gen Zs here. I don't know how many Gen Zs are here, like a handful, it's a conversation that's happening here to when you actually get young people in a room. They are quite vocal. They may not vote, but they are voting on social media. They have opinions. There's just things that I feel that we need to recognize more. And that will help shape some of the interventions that people have. Young people do have agency.
I'd just like to pick up on that in response to your question about what inspires you. I think if you just visit Africa and feel the vibrancy of young people, it's dynamic. And the mindset has shifted. I mean, it's not the generation that we belong to, where we were always looking externally to for help or whatever. I mean, that there's truly a dynamism that just is infectious. Next question. Are we?
There we go, come on. How much do you worry about Russian information in Africa? I know the Russians have invested a huge amount of money. Do you compete with them? Do you ignore them? Or how do you respond to that? Because I know they're there and they're making quite a bit of progress. And the US government is nowhere to be found.
I mean, it's not something that I worry about, because I think every country has its own agenda in Africa, including America, including France. So it's not just a Russian agenda. I think Russia's agenda, like Turkey, like China, is to get friendly with Africa, because we have so much of what the world needs. I think what we need to do as Africa is recognize that. That's it.
There's a question back there.
Hi, thank you so much for everything that you've shared so far today. Something that I heard a while ago about Africa and these narratives is it's difficult to create these narratives because, as you said, there are 54 countries and thousands of languages and different geographies. And so even at the top of this presentation, Moky, when you mentioned the Ukraine war versus African issues, that's comparing a country to a whole continent. So I'm just wondering what your response to that is, and how you think about that when we're talking about Africa. It just feels like it's too general of a term.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a huge problem. I mean, for example, if you're looking at the coups, I think there's 7 countries that had coups, I think, in the last 18 months. And one article is trying to cover 7 coups. How much context are you going to get? People are looking for trends all the time. If you mention 3 countries, it's happening in Africa, right? So it's always, the headline is coups in Africa, and then you actually break it down. Actually, no, 7 countries. Oh, Ebola in Africa. Actually, it was happening in a region in Africa. It wasn't everywhere. And I think that is a problem. But for ease and simplicity, yes, sometimes there are times where you do use Africa. And I use Africa sometimes, but because if I'm talking collectively about 54 countries, then yes, I do. But when I speak to, say funders, and I say, okay, what are you doing? Oh yeah, we're in Africa. Then I always have to say, okay, so which countries are you in? And then they tell me they're in this and that. And maybe for ease, depending on who you're talking to, you say Africa. But I feel you're absolutely right. And a lot of this actually is of our own doing as well. If you sit at these global forums, people are dictate, sort of churning out data based on Africa, and half of me thinks, well, okay, let's be specific, because it's like there's an elephant in the room. If you look at the continent, you're trying to solve Africa, you will never solve Africa. An African proverb, how do you eat an elephant? It's one mouthful at a time. It's a country at a time. So yeah, it's problematic, but we'll get to it. It's one of the many things we'll get to.
Hello, Moky, thank you so much. It's super awesome to hear you talk about all this stuff and very inspiring. My name is John Tenney. I work for a nonprofit based in the United States, but we work very closely with partners in Malawi. And then something that I kind of do on the side that we've been doing over the past couple of years is producing virtual reality programs. And then we also just had our first virtual reality film that is now kind of going around the circuit, but it's made in Malawi by Malawians, co-directed by myself, but then also our marketing personnel was over there. And it was an amazing experience to get to work on that and really start trying to tell an African, but village-based Malawian story. And so my question is how do you see, nonprofits, funders, donors, but then also, artists and producers working towards telling these stories to where, I don't have to be on the front, but I can also work with, local artists and producers to, lift up their voices and really tell those stories. What is, in your perspective, how can we better do that? What's the best approach?
So just ask the actual question. Sorry, what's the question? What was that?
How can people, funders, nonprofits work with local organizations or with individuals, artists, to actually be telling their stories? What is you mentioned that there's a newsroom, but what can we do from this room to continue doing what you're doing to support you and the goal of changing that narrative?
So one of the things that we do, for example, at Philanthropy, we have an ANF Academy because we realize that there's still, I think the creative industry is one of it's a low barrier of entry. You just need to be creative and you can do stuff. And what we found out through focus groups is that a lot of young people, the most prolific university institution of learning in Africa is YouTube. A lot of them are getting their skills from YouTube. And that's not enough to build a quality sort of creative industry. You need more skills, you need better skills. So we do a lot of that. And I think that there's a lot of sort of capacity building you can do behind the scenes. But, for example, I always say when people think about the creative industries, they think we're asking them to be creative. But in order to enable the creative industry, and if you look at the credits on a film, there's only about 20, 30 actors, the rest are all the technical people that are needed to get that creative product out. And I think that's where the lack is, because we don't see that, right? So we need more sound engineers, we need actual film editors, we need technical people. Like, for example, Burna Boy and all these people who are recording, they're not necessarily recording in Africa, they're doing it outside of the continent where the technical capabilities are. So if I think about what is needed, it's the back end of the creative stuff that we need to sort of enable the front end to happen. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your questions and for being such an engaged audience. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Moky.
Yeah.